sometimes it may seem unusual that development is the way to resolve flood risk, but that is what our understanding of the situation is in the much when not context, and that is borne out in the site guidelines for that particular allocation. And as I've already referenced, obviously the site promoters have indicated that they consider that the scheme is viable, and that is borne out in our viability and deliverability topic paper, and that has due regard to the site-specific requirements as well as the sort of wider SIL and affordable housing contributions.
Can I just say on that point as well about this, that site-specific? I know we're not here to talk about site-specifics, but it's been mentioned. That particular site promoter for the site in Much Wenlock has employed engineering evidence about that as well, and that has been before the council and has been before the council's flood and drainage manager, who we have spoken to obviously about our site assessment process and site allocation process. So we have confidence from the site promoter in discussion with our flood and drainage manager that that proposal and guidelines in that site are deliverable.
Just in terms of the other point that Mr. Orr's made, in terms of delivery of infrastructure and development, I think this is often a concern that's raised, and I do understand it, but I think there needs to be recognition that one of the mechanisms for delivery of infrastructure is development, and that's borne out in our approach to infrastructure in terms of DP25 and the fact that SIL and Section 106 contributions are provided by developments to deliver infrastructure. So inevitably there will be that interplay between when infrastructure is delivered and when development takes place. With specific regard to the Ironbridge Power Station site, I'd indicate obviously the Section 106 legal agreement will have specific reference to phasing, which will indicate when funding is required for infrastructure provision linked to when specific stages of development are reached. And that's not an uncommon approach. So that gives us that sort of link between when development takes place and when infrastructure is provided. And that, as I say, that will be embedded within the Section 106 legal agreement, so it will have triggers for when funding is required for infrastructure.
Thank you. I take Mr. Carter next, please.
Thank you, ma'am. Just starting on question 32, sorry, not 32, question 14, isn't it?
You worried me then.
Yeah, that was my paragraph number. It seems to us that the advice in the MPPF, particularly paragraph 34, is quite clear that plans should take account of other infrastructure, and health is one of the specific items that's listed in the brackets that follow that. And actually, the council recognised that in the project brief for the viability assessment in paragraph 4.11. But the viability assessment itself doesn't seem to have taken account of improving health infrastructure, and that's confirmed, I think, by the reference on page 125 of that document from July 2020, that the following matters relating to health and well-being were taken into account, including promoting active travel, promoting access to sustainable travel options, and access to open space. All very important things, but they sort of relate to almost lifestyle aspects of well-being rather than the sort of the more acute side where you actually need sort of treatment. Mr. Drummond Hay, when he made his contribution, I think I heard that he said that health would be taken into account through Section 106 agreements rather than through the or the implication being that health facilities therefore wouldn't be taken into account through the SIL. So I think it would be helpful if that could be clarified, because I mean, I think if that was the case, we would be considerably concerned, because this all goes back to the sort of the contributions I've made previously about, you know, the need for the SIP and so on, and a mechanism to be included in the plan to make sure that any deficiencies that might have happened for one reason or another can be picked up on an ongoing and continuing basis. So it seems to be where we were talking about reference to the SIP in the policy somewhere earlier. I would argue as well that that policy shouldn't refer to the need for the review of SIL, and as part of that, I guess, a review of the viability assessment. Because if that's not the case, I mean, I take the point that the government might change the planning system, but that may not actually happen. And a lot of the principles are going to still be the same, irrespective of almost what the system says. And if there is no review of SIL taken forward and review of the viability study, then potentially that wouldn't need to take place until the next review of the local plan, which would be, say, 5 years off, if not more. So if the SIL's already 9 years old, that means that the SIL could potentially be 14 years old by that stage. So I think it gets back to that mechanism, and from a health infrastructure perspective, we would like the policies to make sure that the position of the provision of health infrastructure and the potential availability of funding to help support that hasn't actually been weakened by the way the back plan has been put together. I think that's really quite a significant point. I think the remaining sort of questions probably cover similar ground to what I've said before, but in relation to question 18, where it talks about the SIP and the projects relying on development contributions and so on, I mean, the point is that the SIP, as it stands, doesn't include all appropriate infrastructure projects, and nor does it include this point I made earlier about the implications of the accumulation of small-scale growth across areas of the plan area. I think that's all I need to say. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. Can the council comment on those points, please?
Yeah, thank you, Ma'am. Just in terms of the health point about how it's been incorporated into the assessment, that is part of the SIL/Section 106 assumptions within that assessment. So there has been an assumption that that would pay for a range of strategic infrastructure, health being one of them. Okay, and as we've already mentioned, that's quite a precautionary approach that we've, or in our view, a precautionary approach in terms of the figures we've used. So it is captured within that assessment in our view. The wider items which Mr. Carter referred to, I think refer to policy specific issues which we have sought to take into account in the assessment. The impact of a development, so the impact of a policy, it is potentially around green infrastructure on development and the cost. So that's I think is what Mr. Carter's referring to there. So that's outside the realm of SIL Section 106 in that respect. So that's our take on that. In terms of the wider point about a SIL review, obviously what we've said today is that the SIL, we're not planning for a review at this point in time, but of course it is up to us as a council when we do undertake a review, so we can change our minds on that one. I think, as we've said, we are, I think, waiting for clarity at the national level, really, for the reasons we've already mentioned on that point. In terms of just the clarification for Mr. Carter's comment about what Mr. Drummond Hayes said about Health Section 106, just to clarify that obviously we have mentioned that health provision will be captured within developer contributions, both within SIL and potentially Section 106. So we're not excluding SIL from that at all. And in fact, we're aware, obviously, from the NHS do make requests for Section 106 contributions and have more recently begun to make requests for Section 106 contributions to health provision. To health provision on the back of new development, and by and large, our response to council is that they will be captured within a wider SIL for the scheme, not via additional Section 106. We're not saying it's not a possibility where there is defined evidence, but more generally speaking, it is the SIL. Hence the importance of Mr. Carter and the NHS being involved within the wider strategic infrastructure network in defining the priorities for use of SIL. Those are the 2 points I wanted to make. I think that covers.
Yeah, just a quick question from me that stemmed out of that. So if there's a viability issue with sites, we've heard that viability is a bit fragile in places, and you have to make choices about, there's only a certain pot of money. How would that be prioritised, if you like? So if the healthcare service, NHS, are saying, we need X number of pounds and the development can't provide it, what would happen in that case?
Well, of course, again, I'll go back to the beauty of the SIL on this respect, that it is a wider pot of money. It doesn't necessarily have to be specifically resulting from a contribution from a particular development. It's not ring-fenced to SIL from a scheme is paid for X. It could be SIL from schemes X, Y, and Z pay for X on that point. No, so there is a wider pot of SIL money available, which we've already mentioned is a relatively significant pot of money and will become more significant, that we can utilise in that instance where there is an issue of non-delivery potential on a site which can't meet its own infrastructure, can't wash it. Can't.
So that gives you a buffer, if you like.
It gives us a buffer. It's a good way of saying it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Ms. Harding, next.
Yes, it's Joanne Harding from the Home Boards Federation. The HBF did have a few concerns that I just wanted to set out. So our concerns, firstly, in relation to the lack of the update for the viability assessment. We are slightly concerned that the viability assessment hasn't been updated to reflect the latest position in terms of the submitted plan or in terms of the evidence that is now available. Secondly, we have some concerns in relation to the assumptions that have been made within the viability assessment. These are set out in more detail in our publication response. We were involved in terms of the draft viability assessment book. There are still some things outstanding, and we would suggest that frequently, we think the best case scenario is being used in the viability assessment, and would suggest that council should perhaps take a more cautious approach. Viability assessments are often highly sensitive to small changes in the inputs, and a small adjustment in one or two assumptions could make a significant impact on the viability of development. Which is particularly relevant in this area where it's challenging, as keeps being pointed out. We also have some concerns in relation to the approach taken to older people's housing, more generally, as was set out before by Mr. Drummond Hay, that they were going to do it on a planning application basis. We do have some concerns with that. It does seem a little unjust that everybody who puts forward an application for an older person's housing development is potentially going to have to submit a viability assessment. The government were moving away from having to submit multiple viability assessments, and we would suggest that this would have been an opportunity to have assessed that as an ongoing issue and as a typology. Older person's housing is quite different in terms of the costing, in terms of build costs. They build to different criteria, obviously, in terms of trying to meet the suitable needs of older people. And we consider this is something that should have been considered as part of the viability assessment. We also have concerns in relation to the conclusions, obviously, in terms of the plan. We do appreciate the extra work the council has done in terms of speaking to promoters and developers in terms of their topic paper and trying to ensure that the sites will come forward. But we would suggest that whilst at the precise moment, those are obviously considered to be deliverable and viable. It is worth noting, as I said before, a small change in terms of the circumstances in this challenging environment could be something that tips those sites over. Again, we'd also note that this hasn't considered all development sites, hasn't considered Windfall, hasn't considered the SAMDEV sites. So again, there are still sites that haven't been considered that may be in those challenging typology categories where they're not viable or they're marginally viable. We'd also like to come back in terms of the price, house prices at the moment. Obviously, we all agree it's very positive in terms of where the house prices are and where we've seen increases, but this might not last. We'd like to say that the build cost increases have also been significant. And again, as I say, those small changes in terms of adjustments can have significant consequences in terms of what's happening going forward, and particularly as we're bringing in new regimes in terms of the new building regulation elements, which obviously is new technology, means new skills for the builders, etc. So obviously all impact on the price increases as we're going forward. I'd say that there's still a concern really about the benchmark land values and how much can be taken off that in terms of still having willing landowners in the future that are willing to sell their sites and bring those forward. So again, I think that's still a concern for us. And finally, we would agree with what the council is saying. We think there are some challenging circumstances. It could be more challenging going forward. And we'd strongly recommend that the council keep it under review, monitor the viability and the deliverability of these sites as they go forward. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think quite a lot of those points the council have already addressed when we started on this topic. Do you want me to take the next person and then come back, or is there a particular point you'd like to address now?
Just keep going.
Yeah, but just keep going.
Let's keep going.
Yeah, I think a lot of them were addressed
Yeah,
in the original sort of opening comments. So Mr. Coxon.
Thank you, Ma'am. Good afternoon. John Coxon on behalf of the Strategic Land Group. Our response relates to question 17 and the cumulative impacts of the policy requirements. Now, the viability assessment, as we've heard, shows that development isn't viable on nearly all the typologies in the north of the county. Now, paragraph 12.97 of the study says that we see that, but we're going to go for 10% affordable housing in the north based on the ground experience. And obviously Mr. Drummond-Hay talked about that we are seeing development. I suppose just a word of caution on that is that obviously that on the ground experience thus far is before these new policy requirements come in, such as 10% biodiversity net gain and M42 and M43 accessibility requirements. That being said, we certainly don't advocate, Mark, that you would look for 0% affordable housing or anything like that. As Mr. Drummond-Hay said, it's a very important aspect of the local plan. But paragraph 12.97 also warns in relation to the north that the council should be cautious about relying on development from this area to deliver the housing requirements. And I think where we think the concern lies, Ma'am, is it should be in relation to the extent to which the typologies are not viable and whether some of the policy requirements, how they impact on that. I think, Ma'am, I'd refer you to Appendix 15 of the documents. That's page 316 of the document, or it's on PDF page 206 of EV 11502.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I'm not going to start taking you through. There's a whole raft of figures, but I think it's a really useful table. And I commend Mr. Drummond-Hay for the way it's set out, in fact, in terms of scanning the different policy requirements and seeing what the impacts are on the different typologies. Now, the final column there sets out the impact, the total cumulative impact of the requirements and the extent to which the northern typologies aren't viable. Now, in terms of other columns, obviously, just to comment briefly, obviously sill, we know that sill is in place and is currently fixed. 10% biodiversity net gain, obviously there's a question as to whether it should be coming in straight away with this plan, but we know it's coming down the line, so there's not a lot we can do in terms of viability on that, and things like electric vehicle charging points, you know, that's going to be a requirement moving forward anyway for all sites. So I think what I'd just like to do on that table is just draw your attention to the second and the third to last columns, and that's the impact of the M42 and the M43 requirements, which do have a meaningful impact and a significant impact on viability. And I think what we would say is that adjusting those requirements or removing them would have a meaningful positive impact on viability. It would help to reduce some of those risks to development and deliverability that the assessment identifies. Now, I think I'll probably leave it there because we're going to come back to later in the examination the justification for those requirements, and I think that obviously goes hand in hand with, you know, whether they are actually necessary to make development acceptable in planning terms. But I really wanted to make that point now on the viability, and then, as I say, we'll come back to that at a later stage when we look at the justification and the need. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coxon. I'll bring the council back in now because there were quite different points being made there.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. I think the first point is obviously there was a number of comments about the policy requirements of BP1. I don't want to go into them in too much detail because obviously we'll consider them at a separate stage, but we previously discussed Shropshire Council's strategy for meeting the needs of older people, and how we consider the strategy embedded within the plan is consistent with our adult social care approach to meeting needs. And a key part of that is supporting people to be able to remain in their own homes. And we consider an important part of that is the M42 and M43 provision. And that is based on information we've done our strategic housing market assessment in terms of needs, and the rates proposed in the plan have been informed by that and have also been specifically considered within the viability assessment. We are of the view that they are important and they're part of meeting the needs of our communities. Yes, providing a sufficient volume of housing is important, but as is providing the right type of housing. And I think that is a really important message. With regard to Mr. Coxon, obviously his site, MBR 006, I believe, is located in the north of Shropshire. The response that we've received to our correspondence with regard to that specific site is that it's viable.
With the policy.
Yeah, policy compliant, it's viable. So, I mean, it's one where the views from the site promoters is that their sites are viable and in regard to our policy requirements. We consider that we've got the balance right. I think Mr. Drummond-Hayes very thoroughly explained the viability assessment process that we've undertaken, and that has directly informed our policy requirements. And I think if you look at the study, it's very clear that there were aspirations for higher requirements. And as a result of the study, we have had to amend our aspirations accordingly. And clearly there are factors that have to be balanced in the viability study and in the policy requirements, whether that's affordable housing, access to accessible housing, energy efficiency. We've got many different aspirations in the plan. We have to get the balance right, and that's where the viability study has come in and informed our approach. And we feel that we've got the balance right. We feel that the evidence before you in the viability study demonstrates that we've got the balance right.
Can I just pick up on a more general point here? Obviously, we have done the additional work which was requested of us by Mr. Drummond-Hay to provide further reassurance really on our site allocations are viable, and we've done that, and that's within the topic paper we have prepared. as a wider point here, obviously, I can understand from the development industry, it's not unexpected, shall we say, that they will say every further policy requirement takes a little bit of us. Okay, it's forever been noted. Well, I will say on that one, there's a role here for further discussions for them with their landowners on that point as well. So I'll just leave it there. Oh, and so I think Mr. Drummond has got some points to make as well.
Okay, thank you.
I think what Joanne said about an update and the fact that we're in an uncertain period is particularly timely, because on one hand, it's suggested that we should be doing an update. But on the other hand, even if we did an update, we need to be really careful because we don't know what house prices are going to do. I think that from your point of view, you can have confidence in this work that we put in front of you, because we did it, we made some findings, and since then, the headline data suggests house prices has increased more than build costs. So viability will have improved, and the difference is very substantial. And there are additional costs from electric charging points and these other standards that are coming in. But even taking those into account, one needs to, one can still have confidence with the study. And I think if you take electric charging points as an example, I'm a driver of an electric car, and when I got my electric car, you got an enormous subsidy for having your charging point put in. Well, now, and they cost £1,200 for the chap to come and bolt it on the outside of your house. Now you don't get a subsidy. There's competition within the market, and you can get that for about £625. So that's in 2 years the price for the same bit of kit has come down. And I would imagine that that's going to continue as we go forward. And if you think about the last change in to Part L, the building regs to do with energy efficiency, when we had to start using condensing boilers, well, a condensing boiler used to cost over £1,000. Now they are cheaper than the old-fashioned boilers, just because people know how to build them, and they have become the norm, and people have geared up to do it. And that will happen with all these changes as the building industry begins to understand how they work. I'd just like to mention land value capture, because it is the government's favourite sort of topic. And it is really this, that there's an uplift from the grant of planning permission, a huge benefit for the landowner. And we've got two sides to the argument. The landowners, and I act for landowners as well as local authorities, all want more. And the other side of the argument is that all the value should be captured because it's just a windfall that a landowner has done nothing to earn. Well, those of us who are in the industry know that it's much more complicated than that, and there's a balance. But where these new requirements come in, that there does need that the benchmark, that they will be reflected in the benchmark land value. And the assumption, the implication from what has been said was that landowners shouldn't be impacted at all by policies, which I would suggest is entirely wrong. And even my landowning clients would tend to agree that we do need to move with the times, and these moves towards higher environmental standards and what have you, they have to be met somewhere. And the landowner will bear the cost of some of that. I'm not ready. And I think that if you look at the thinking going on behind the levy, the new levy, we're going to see higher land value capture in the future. But who knows what government we're going to have to take that forward.
Thank you. I'll move now on to Mr. Deeves.
Thank you, Ma'am. Where to start? I've listened particularly to Mr. Drummond-Hay with some interest, and first of all, let me say that I'm sure he's carried out his work very professionally and within the framework that he was given. Mr. Orrs touched on some of the confusion. How can you quantify and assure that quantification has taken place, whereas at the same time you are simply saying we will make an allowance under Civil Law Section 106. And as Mr. Green has pointed out earlier, a lot of that money is not spent. There seems an inherent contradiction in that. Mr. Drummond-Hay, just in his last few remarks, talked about the way the market will respond to environmental change requirements, and he's, in a narrow sense, correct, obviously. But what I'm concerned about, going to the point I want to make really around question 16, is that the analysis that he presents is concerned with the instantaneous viability. It is not concerned with the cost of living with that infrastructure. The national framework sets out all over the place infrastructure. I'll quickly, you can search for the words as well as I can, but paragraphs 20, 26, 41, 34, 92C, 96, all reference different sorts of infrastructure inputs in the national framework, and they don't seem to be properly incorporated into what's done here. Ms. Harding talked about the particular types of housing that require special construction for elderly people or people with disability. I would say the same applies to the general provision of affordable housing. Affordable housing does not only mean that you can afford to buy it, it also, or part buy it, it also means that you can afford to live in it for a long period of time. So that this whole question of the scope of the viability is, to my mind, very suspect, and I would certainly welcome a wholesale revision of how the assessments are carried out. And I think, given the general imperatives in the national framework, that the council should do more work on this before the findings of the assessment the viability assessment they propose to use are actually adopted. Thank you.
Can I just ask you a question, Mr. Deeves? So what kind of extra work would you have them look at, Mr. Deeves? You've disappeared.
Well, sorry, Ma'am. Well, ma'am, for instance, going back to the narrow point of electric vehicle charging points, I would argue, for instance, does the viability assessment process require developers at any stage to consider the real costs of a wholly green energy provision system? There are many developments up and down the country where a number of houses share communal energy schemes of one sort or another, but I don't see those scenarios being incorporated into the viability process. It seems to be, we will build as we build now, we will take account of the market and the increase in volume and efficiency for certain technological change, as Mr. Drummond-Hay identifies, but I don't see the vision or the breadth of imagination that says we could build significantly differently, not just the brick of the house, but the way we put the whole development together. I hope, does that answer your question a little bit?
It does, yes, that's helpful.
See where I'm trying to get to. Thank you very much.
That's helpful, and hopefully it helps the council to be able to respond.
Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you.
In some respects, I agree with what is being said. However, this viability, we don't do viability assessments as a leisure activity. We do them because the PPG tells us to do them, and they're to address a very specific purpose. And that's whether or not the development plan is going to be deliverable, and whether or not the council have spent all this time and money and thought in writing this very long plan, and is it going to work? And that is that is a tool for viability testing. And so we assess the cumulative impact of the proposed policies and what the impact will be on development viability. Now, some things have no material test in terms of economic viability, and we really are talking about economic viability, but others do, and some are almost impossible to capture in a financial appraisal of this type. We know that the building to higher environmental standards, where the cost of living in a house is significantly reduced, it increases the value of the house. Simply because people can then borrow more money. In the old days, when you applied for a mortgage, the bank or building society just multiplied your income by 3.5 or whatever it was, and you either got a mortgage or you didn't. Now you have to fill in about 20 pages of very detailed forms about how much you spend every week and how many pizzas you buy, and I mean, you name it, how many times you go to the cinema. It's all in there. But part of it is if you have if you're buying a higher rated house, then you can then your electricity bills are less. Therefore, it follows you can borrow more money to buy the house. And there's quite a lot of research to reflect that. So it doesn't ignore these changes, but it is an economic viability assessment. I think I'd just like to mention the point on affordable housing. And this, can you still hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. On affordable housing, when we did these viability assessments years ago, we used to assume affordable housing was built to a different standard. That's no longer the case. They're built to a different standard, but in terms of cost, it's a similar standard. So whereas a market house might have German white goods, an affordable house might have a kitchen that has been selected for how long it is going to last. And so the costs balance themselves out. We no longer apply different costs, but affordable housing gets caught by increases in environmental standards like every other type of house.
Thank you, that's helpful. I'll bring in Mr. Grace next. Have you got some problems?
Yeah, we're in the cycle where we can't turn off now. So
We'll have a 5-minute comfort break, shall we? It's been a while since we had a break. So if we just have 5 minutes to allow the council to do whatever they need to do. Sorry, Mr. Grace. I think this happened to you last time.
Getting a phobia.
So we'll just have a break for 5 minutes. I'll just wait Mr. Grace for the council to appear again, then I know that they're everything's working.
You have to forgive me, I may have to dip out just after we've finished this a little bit because I've got other commitments.
That's fine, yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Ah, we're back. Oh, he's zoomed out again now. We have a different camera. Are you okay if Mr. Grace continues? He just explained he needs to go soon. So yeah. Okay, Mr. Grace.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, I do appreciate that the viability study is all about trying to demonstrate the plan is sound and obviously defending the plan against a lot of demands. I wanted to come back to Mr. Drummond-Hayes' question around maximising public benefit. In doing so, I fully recognise that in Much Wenlock, the developer promoter of the site is reassuring everybody that they can develop that site and it's no problem. Of course he would. The sense of it, for me though, that's on a site which is very flood prone and so on. You'll deal with that at stage 2, I'm sure. But Shropshire Council came forward in the original draft, the preferred site, with a scheme for 80 houses on that site. And then changed, the goalposts moved in the middle of the process and suddenly it was increased by 50% to 120 houses. Now, that's essentially telling us that that site is very difficult to deliver and very costly in that sense. And then distorts the policy about the scale of development in the town and so forth. But Mr. Drummond-Hayes' comments around maximising public benefit, does that not tell us that there's something around the way that the plan needs to evolve, looking at viability, rather than be driven by viability, actually to be more effective, that the plan needs to look at other sites that don't need so much mitigation and therefore release more funding for other infrastructural benefits and better benefits that colleagues like Mr. Deeves and others have talked about. So we get more benefit, more effective delivery of use of land and the infrastructure that is required through the viability process. And I don't know whether Mr. Drummond-Hay could comment around whether that lens was used or not.
Thank you, Mr. Grace. So what you're saying is if there's a pot of money, rather than it being spent on mitigation, it could be used for more benefits in the community, that sort of thing.
Yeah, why do the hard thing? And I'm sure national policy
Yes.
is about not doing the hard thing. It's about getting to the right place and the right site, doing the right thing for the place you're talking about. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask the council that question.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I think Mr. Grace's point on this one is less for Mr. Drummond-Hay and actually more for Australia in terms of a site assessment process, really, because the specific example which Mr. Grace uses is about the site in Much Wenlock, which in an earlier iteration of the plan making process was proposed for around 80 dwellings, is now for 120 dwellings. So yes, an increase, and part of the reason for that increase was because of the benefit that scheme would have on the local community, in the council's view, about alleviating flood risk. And the information we had from the site promoter was that was a requirement of the scheme to uplift the capacity in order to achieve that. So that's a consideration we factored into our site assessment process rather than anything which Mr. Drummond-Hay has sought to comment on. We obviously concluded at that point that the benefit in our view, the benefit to the community outweighed any concern about any uplift in that site allocation. I realise that's not a view shared by Mr. Grace.
Thank you. So I'll bring in next Mr. Hopkins.
Thank you, Mum. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Thank you. Mike Hopkins, from JLL, acting on behalf of Stanmore Consortium. 2 points really. The first one briefly, just picking up on what Ms Harding said, just in terms of the update of the delivery and viability study. I think reflecting what she said, I think we have got concerns about that update, and I think the further point I wanted to make is that it's clear that July study is largely based on data that was provided in December 2019 and actually earlier than that as well, which is almost over 12 months before the regulation 19, which is clearly prior to the pandemic starting as well. So I think we have got concerns, and simply saying house prices have increased, therefore viability will be improved seems too simplistic in terms of meeting the requirements set out in paragraph 35 of the MPPF. That's the first point. The second point briefly is looking at the assessment of the infrastructure costs and the detail that's set out in the delivery and viability assessment for the strategic sites. Within the study, paragraph 10.83, it states that the council is working up the assessment of the strategic infrastructure and mitigation requirements for the sites, and it provides estimates based upon a blended sill rate. So we've got an expectation that there's further assessments that will be undertaken. Reference is also made to, as Mr Drummond-Hay said, to the Harman guidance in paragraph 10.85, which encourages the use of good quality information at an early stage rather than waiting until the development management stage. And I think that's important. If I can just refer you to the council's hearing statement on matter 8, which at paragraph 17.5 and 18.3, it states.
Sorry, just give me those paragraphs.
Sorry, 17.5 and 18.3. They're actually just replicated the text. So that states that bespoke assessments of potential infrastructure costs were undertaken for strategic sites. And we're struggling to find further information for those bespoke surveys. We're aware that further assessments have been undertaken in certain areas, including highways, mitigation highway reports, and mitigation that's been provided, but there's no evidence of cost estimates that go beyond the assessment undertaken in the delivery and viability study. Figures in table 18.1 of the hearing statement set out the figures for the section 106 contributions, simply replicate the figures in paragraph 10.83 of the delivery strategy. We can't see evidence that the further detailed assessment's been undertaken as suggested in the delivery and viability study, particularly where it's acknowledged that the need for good quality information rather than waiting until the development management stage, as stated in the Harman guidance. That's all I want to say at this stage.
Thank you. Quite a few points there, maybe the council can come back and address, please.
I think in the first instance, in the context of the figures that were assumed for strategic sites in the viability study, the approach we took, I think, as Mr. Drummond-Hay has already explained, was very precautionary. And I think the following paragraph, Mr. Hopkins referenced 10.83, and I think 10.84 explains the fact that, in effect, we use precautionary rates for Section 106 assumptions on top of SIL, but there was a recognition that in actuality there is an interaction between SIL and Section 106, and I think that's very much reflected in our policy approach in DP25, which effectively recognises SIL as the starting point, and then Section 106 is over and above where the infrastructure needs require it. So we're very much of the view that the study that was undertaken was very precautionary, and as such gives us confidence in terms of the viability.
I don't think Mr. Hopkins specifically referenced a site, so we won't mention anything about site specifics. So, but I think obviously we do have more information on a number of our strategic locations within the statements of common ground that have been submitted to the examination, which includes additional reassurance and, where possible, further information around costings on those sites, and those are obviously with you as well. So that's where we're at with that particular issue. If Mr. Hopkins had a particular site in mind, we can perhaps comment on that. But I don't think you mentioned a specific site.
In terms of the principle about infrastructure, I think we already described on the last matter 7, the fact that it's inevitable that your understanding of the infrastructure requirements and costs for a scheme will be refined as you go through the process. The local plan process is strategic in its nature, and as we work towards the planning application process, that information in terms of the needs and the costs associated with them will be refined. I think that's inevitable. That's why we take a precautionary approach to costings. But that does give us confidence in terms of deliverability. But yeah, I think that is inevitable, that understanding will be refined as we move forward. And as I say, I think for all our sites, the guidelines recognise the need for appropriate assessments to inform that that understanding.
I will just make a final point on that as well. Obviously, our site promotions are from a variety of people, whether they be landowners, site promotion companies, or in some instances, actual end users themselves, with housing developers. And so we do have a mixture of that. So I think particularly where we have had information specifically from housing developers, including major housing developers, that provides us with further reassurance about the deliverability of that site.
Thank you. Mr. Green.
Thank you. I hope you can see me and hear me.
I can. You're a bit fuzzy, but I can see you.
I always appear very small on my screen. It's general points really, as ever, mainly on discussion point 15, whether the viability assessment is up to date, whether it justifies the policies in the local plan, and moving on to considerations of monitoring as well. So we all know that money is the driver of many, if not most, decisions, and viability, or the ability to make an acceptable profit, is of course a vital consideration. As Mr. Drummond-Hay said, it's the nub of whether the plan is deliverable, whether developments are actually profitable. I think he said that the expectation is for a 15 to 20% developer's profit margin, which compared to some other profit margins does seem generous. It again highlights what I said before, whether we're in a plan-led system or a developer-led system. But what I'm really concerned about is the difference between theory and actuality, really. The viability assessment is obviously a theoretical exercise rooted in practice, but it would always be good to see how things turn out. And viability assessments for individual developments are usually kept private for confidentiality reasons. So it's difficult to get at them, which is something I'm interested as a chartered accountant who's been used to doing accounts all my life. So I like to see these financial figures, and they're always difficult to get at. So it's good to see these viability reports. But Mr. Drummond-Hay mentioned the particular circumstance of Ironbridge, which he described as a challenging instance. I'd say it's also rather a cautionary tale as well. The Ironbridge, he assessed, or the viability assessment assessed Ironbridge as to its viability. I don't know whether you've got that viability assessment open in front of you, EV 115.01.
Yeah, which page are you on?
Well, it's page 177 is an instance. Right down at the bottom, second line from the bottom.
Yeah. Just have
So
to make the text a bit bigger so I can see it.
Yeah, mine's not very big, but it doesn't matter about the figures really. It's he's assessing there whether it's viable with 10% of affordable housing, and on all the scenarios it comes out green, so viable on that. That assessment was done June 2020. Just so happens that by that stage the Ironbridge planning application, which is 19/05560/out, had already been submitted in December 2019. But along they came in September 2020 with their own viability assessment, pleading poverty and that they could only afford 5% affordable housing. That assessment was done not on residual value basis, but on some different basis. I can't remember what it is now, but it's some basis that the developers thought to be more appropriate to Ironbridge's circumstances. I admit Ironbridge is maybe a special case, but so that was put before the planning committee and they threw it out at 5%, and it came back and they've sort of managed to get to 10% by including the retirement village, is my understanding of it, which was there anyway. So the upshot is that we have a very different viability assessment only 3 months after Mr. Drummond Hayes' assessment. So it goes to the root of, you know, the difference between actuality and reality. So I think my point really is, could there not be some monitoring of this so that we are able to see how subsequent viability assessments by other developers, and there will be others, they'll all cry poverty, we've heard them crying poverty now. So to see what the outturn actually is, because I say usually it's a murky area, because usually stuff like that is kept private for so-called confidentiality reasons, despite the fact that we all know that money is what drives it. So one ought to be able to see those figures. So that's my point on that, really.
So just to check, when you talk about monitoring, do you mean monitoring after adoption of the plan or before the plan's adopted?
Well, something, well, the authority monitoring report, could there not be something in that? You know, which is the authority monitoring report is meant to show how the plan is performing against its policies. So is it performing? The instance of Ironbridge indicates that even 3 months after an assessment, the plan is not performing on a major development.
Yeah, I understand that, yeah.
And I have other points on monitoring when I think we're going back to it. You're doing this first because some people need to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Do the council want to come back on some of those points?
I think I can give Mr. Green confidence and answer his question quite succinctly. Paragraph 10.021 of the viability section of the PPG says any viability assessment should be prepared on the basis that it should be made publicly available other than in exceptional circumstances. And then even in those circumstances, information should be provided. Historically, viability assessments were kept very confidential, but because of the way the PPG has been updated, and it's an assessment for planning, not a commercial viability assessment, there should be no problem and no reason for it not to be put in the public domain and not to be published.
So my understanding is a lot of them are open book now, so an open book approach, and then the council would maybe get somebody else to verify it. Yeah.
I think I've covered the other points elsewhere.
That is a comfort. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Deeves, I've already heard from you, and I said I would only take one comment from each person, so I'm going to move on for fairness reasons to other people that I've let only speak once. Is there anybody got any further comments on viability that's not already spoken? I think it's covered everything I had on my list. No. Okay, so we'll return to monitoring and implementation. Does the council want to put their camera back on a moment? So I'm happy if Mr. Drummond Hayes wants to go now. I know we've kept him until just after 5.
I think enjoy these. I sit at home, or I sit in my office for weeks waiting for local plan hearings.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for your help. So turning to monitoring implementation, I think again we'll take these questions in the round. We touched on it in Ms Dillon's session this morning, where the council agreed to go back and look at some of the points. We'll also look at it as part of the DM policies. I suspect as we go through those, we'll and the site allocations policies. So it's one of those sort of areas that we tend to deal with at stage 1, but actually it's something that we assess throughout the examination. And there is an opportunity, as with anything, we can come back to it at the end if there are particular issues as things get amended and things. So I don't know whether anybody particularly wants to make any comments at this stage. Mr. Green, you said you wanted to comment on monitoring and implementation. And Mr. Fox. Before I bring people in, did the council want to say anything as a preliminary comment, or?
I think we're okay to hear what others have to say and respond if needed.
Okay, Mr. Green then.
Thank you. I didn't expect to come straight back in again. It's a point I've raised with the council over and over again. They're building all these houses. They seem to have no way of knowing who comes to live in them all. The reason we build them, we're told, is because they're said to be needed, or rather 25,894 of them are said to be needed. But there's no way of knowing whether the people going into them are elderly downsizers, people locating from Shropshire, disabled people, other specialist people, people coming in from the Black Country, coming in from Wolverhampton. Where do these people come from? Are we just building houses and looking at the total numbers and that's all we're monitoring? Or should we not look at whether the plan is doing what it's meant to be doing in terms of building the right houses in the right place? That could be done in the annual monitoring report, I would have thought. If you look at well, again, our Appendix 1 to the housing and employment targets, which we looked at yesterday. Completions from 2016-17 to 2020-21 are said to be 7,258. Well, that's nearly a quarter of the overall requirement. Those with planning permission are about the same again. So we're already, 4 or 5 years into the plan. We're already nearly at half of what the plan is meant to be doing. Could there not be some monitoring of whether they are actually building the sort of houses that are needed? I mean, the only thing in the annual monitoring report, as far as I can make out, is the gross numbers of total houses and the total numbers of affordable houses. I would have thought it's possible to give some better impression of whether they really are building the right houses. That's my only point, really.
Okay, I'll ask the council, but I suspect that's very difficult and timely information to gather, and would be it would be reliant on people, I suppose, answering questionnaires.
Some of my requests don't take into account the small nature of the planning policy team, which you've seen. I know Mr. West early on said, what you see is what you get. So I am well aware in many of my points that it's just simply not possible because it's too much work, really. The same applies with keeping the viability assessment up to date, I suppose, with some.
Yeah, I'm not sure it would even be possible, but we can ask the council, but.
Well, when in case of viability, it means paying someone else to do it, essentially.
I'll bring the council in, please.
Yes, I think as Mr. Green's pointed out, obviously we do have to respect our resources here. We have set out a monitoring framework. Just getting to this specific point about the right houses. I wouldn't necessarily say for the right individuals, because I don't think that's quite what you're saying. I think it's more to do with the right houses and are they being built. Obviously, we have set out in DP1, policy DP1, which I know is not part of our part of this examination at this point in time, but that does set out a more detailed approach to the type of housing that we will be seeking to deliver. As an acknowledgement that we are looking more generally to deliver more lower cost market dwellings for working people. And that is, again, goes back to the wider strategy around economic growth and labour force. So it is linked with that. But in terms of monitoring and that specific point, we have set out a specific monitoring indicator about the number of relating to the it's the bedroom spaces in rooms approved in Shropshire. So it's how many one, how many two bedroom, how many three bedroom, etc., etc. Now we can get that information. We think that is possible and within the realms of monitoring, and that is why we've set that indicator out. We think it's realistic. Obviously, we don't want to set indicators which we simply cannot monitor in a realistic manner. We think that is one.
On the point that Mr. Green made about who occupies dwellings, I unfortunately agree with you, Mrs. Crosby. I don't know how we could possibly monitor that. Even if we were able to, I think there'd be a real data protection concern that if we started publishing that data, we could be putting ourselves in a difficult situation. So whilst I understand the point, I don't see that there's a way that we can actually achieve that and publish that data in an appropriate manner.
No, I don't see that there's any way you could really do that. But yeah, we'll move on now to Mr. Fox. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crosby. Hopefully you can see me.
I can, yes.
Hi there, it's Matthew Fox, acting on behalf of Miller Homes. I just wanted to come back on question 13 and the reference to triggers and a potential local plan review, which I think has been discussed at earlier sessions, but
yeah,
I've just got a brief point. I think just to say that we fully support the Black Country's request for that policy review mechanism to be actually factored into the plan. We think it's important to have a firm commitment to keep the plan under review, not just to have a 5-year window, because things could change in that period. I think from our perspective, there's 3 specific reasons. Firstly, and we'll come on to it tomorrow, there's a high level of windfall allowance in the plan. I think it's approximately 16% of the supply, which is quite uncertain. There's also a high provision of save sites which don't benefit from planning permission, over 2,000 dwellings. And then the third reason is probably the most important, and that's the Black Country's unmet need is likely to be firmed up in the next couple of years as a consequence of their examination process. So we feel it's important that the provision which Shropshire are making to both housing and employment should be monitored. It's important that it's kept under review. We know there's 1,500 units are being delivered over the plan period. It's important that on an annual basis, we know how much is being delivered and contributing to the Black Country. aside from what's been delivered for Shropshire. We think there's a number of examples across the West Midlands. We think the best ones are probably Lichfield and South Staffs. They've both got policy review requirements in them, and they've got end dates where the review has to be submitted. So we feel there's sort of precedent for that as well. And finally, yeah, we support the reference in the ABCA submission that they've got a draft policy. I think they've appended some suggested wording, which also refers to the role which safeguarded sites can play in that early review process. So we'd strongly support that position. And we've also set out in our hearing statement some examples as well, one of which is West Lancashire, where there's actually a mechanism to allow the drawdown of safeguarded land in advance of a local plan review.
Thank you, Mr. Fox.
Thank you.
I won't bring the council in immediately because I think lots of those points have been covered last week. I'll move to Mr. Orbs, and if the council want to pick them up in a few minutes, they can do.
Thank you. I've two questions. I'm on. The first is for you, Madam Inspector, if that's okay. When I was looking at monitoring and trying to understand the context of that, I went to the National Planning Framework, Policy Framework, to understand what the scope of monitoring should be. I couldn't really see anything in there. There was nothing about governance, monitoring. If I searched on control, there's a few words, but not a lot. So my question to you is, what's the context of it? But the question that I've got for the council to aid you answering my question is, the monitoring that's being proposed is all around meeting the volume of build that's laid out in the plan. So is it on track to actually build what's necessary? My question is, on all plans, there are interdependencies. So there should be, on any decent plan, an interdependency between certain build sites and infrastructure provision. So where one is identified as a precursor for the other, it should be included in the plan, and it should be part of any monitoring and assurance. And going back to the point that the council made earlier, which is sometimes you need to develop in order to provide infrastructure provision, that is true unless there is actually a shortfall in that provision causing hardship to residents already, and actually the proposed approach to it won't actually materially address it. I know that is for a later debate, but the point I'm making is that monitoring and control is not just about the number of houses being built. It is, in the context of matter 8, it has to be, surely, that it is monitoring the effective delivery of infrastructure to support those houses as well, in a transparent way for the people of Shropshire to see.
Thank you, Mr. Ov. So in terms of the question to me, I know there is some references in the MPPF, and I think, I'm just trying to look, I can't see it off the top of my head. I think there's probably something in the planning practice guidance as well, but the council might be able to answer that question better and answer the rest of your questions. So I'll ask the council to come in.
Thank you, Mark. Just picking up the last speaker's question about monitoring. I'll say our monitoring framework proposed in the plan is not simply about housing delivery or delivery or development more generally, as was implied. It is based upon delivery of the policies, and obviously not every policy is specifically about development delivery. It's about how development is managed in that respect. So we've built, in our view, the monitoring indicators around the policies as we are supposed to do. One of those policies, again, is the infrastructure policy, DP number 25, and that does have a specific infrastructure indicator as well. If you go through sections, progress against programmes and projected identified in the Shropshire infrastructure plan and place plans. So there is a specific reference to monitoring against infrastructure requirements set out in the strategic infrastructure and investment plan and place plans within our plan. So there is a monitoring framework for infrastructure. In terms, I think my colleague is just looking frantically on the PPG guidance.
Yeah, I think it's in the MPPG on plan making. There's reference to.
Yeah, I just found it there. I thought that's where it was. I don't think there's a specific area as such, but if you do a word search, it comes up in various.
I think it's like a theme throughout, which is, yeah, I mean, the point of monitoring is it can inform, as you say, the implementation and inform policy developments, and it's sort of threaded throughout that process, if you like. So yeah.
I just found the paragraph that is just say, what is the role of the authority monitoring report? And that maybe provides some more.
Could you repeat the name of the document, please? Apologies.
So it's the planning practice guidance, so you'll be able to find it online.
Thank you.
And there's a section called, I think it's just called plan making. And in the plan making section, if you do a search of monitoring, you'll kind of see that as you go through, it's not that easy to just give paragraphs like it is with the MPPF. It's designed to be a sort of living document that the government update regularly, so it's not that user friendly at times, but hopefully you find what you need, and if not, the council might be able to help you more with navigating.
Apologies, I also have to drop off, same as Mr. Grace. So thank you very much for your time, Inspector and Council.
Thank you. So next is Mr. Roberts.
I was just going to say that we
Sorry.
didn't have any response to Mr. Fox's comment. Obviously, he made a comment which has been rehearsed a number of times about early review mechanism. I think you've got our position on that. It's not the same as Mr. Fox's, but you've got our position on that, I think.
I think it'll probably come up again at various points.
I was hoping we'd get through the day without mentioning it after an unmet need, but not quite there. Not quite there.
Okay, Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, ma'am. Oh,
You look like a ghost.
I seem to be very white, don't I? Just a second. It's not much better.
I think it's maybe just to do with the light in the room you're in. Don't worry.
There's a lot of sun over Telford at the moment, which is unusual.
Yeah, it's cloudy here where I am.
You should move to Telford. This is a very general question, and I don't know what the response might be, but it's really going back to basics. Paragraph 7 of the framework says that the purpose of the planning system is to help with the achievement of sustainable development. And policy SP1 of the draft local plan says that development will contribute towards making settlements more sustainable. Now then, matters that affect sustainability, for instance, the existence of local services, can change quite quickly. In a couple of the examples that I referred to last Thursday, this is to do with villages. You remember Longdon and Cockshott were mentioned. The local services that were being considered changed overnight. This made the difference in the categorisation of those settlements, one becoming a hub, the other losing that status. Now, at Appendix 4 of the draft local plan, the council has listed the manner in which monitoring will take place. And as expected, they've referred to the numbers of houses or employment land that would be delivered. So they'll keep a check on those to see if targets are being met, as well as some other things. But achieving the target of a housing supply or employment land supply doesn't in itself make a settlement more sustainable. And that was the point about the village of Longdon that I'd mentioned. So my question is, how will the council monitor their aim of making settlements more sustainable? And what will they do if they find that the settlements are not achieving that aim? The reason I ask that is that if those settlements could change their sustainability credentials, if you like, overnight, this can happen all over the place. And what will the council do if, say, Longdon were to lose a service or Cockshott was to gain a service, and yet they are caught in a particular category of housing development? Thank you, ma'am. That's it.
Thank you. I'll ask the council to respond on that.
Okay, thank you, Mark. The first point that I think Mr. Roberts was making was about how do you monitor your general sustainable development. I will again go back to my previous answer about monitoring and indicators having to be objective and rational in that respect. So this is why, as you will see in this plan, and probably as you will see in many local plans, that there is inevitably going to be a focus on numbers, whether that be numbers of dwellings or number of planning applications or that kind of role in terms of monitoring the delivery of a policy. What I think Mr. Roberts is referring to is a subjective notion really here around SP1, which is quite hard to accommodate. I would say it sounds very grandiose, this, but I'll say it anyway, that obviously if the wider plan is working, the plan is seeking to deliver a sustainable development approach. So if the wider plan is working, our view would be sustainable development is being achieved more generally. But that's perhaps a slightly grandiose point for this late in the day. Just in terms of the second point about the services, and this is going back, I think, to the conversation about the hierarchy of settlements and where settlements sit within that, and because we based it on a facilities and access to facilities and services. And as we explained last week, this is a point in time, and whether that was going to be in response to Mr. Roberts' direct question about what would we seek to do in the circumstance that either a settlement lost a service or a settlement gained a service, it would have to be through a development plan review that was reviewed in our view, because that is the only mechanism to change the hierarchy within a development plan. So that's the answer we gave last week, and that's the answer we'll give this week as well.
And it seems as though from what you said last week that is reviewed on a periodical basis in terms of services in settlements and things. Yeah, well, the approach was a bespoke approach for the plan. It wasn't an approach something the council was seeking to do outside the plan. It was specifically to inform the preparation of the plan, and that has been through various iterations because of the updated information we've had throughout the process. There's nothing to stop us continuing to monitor that, and in fact, I think it's probably a good thing to do anyway. It's quite resource heavy, but I think it's a good thing to do. The trick is though, how would that impact upon the change of a settlement from, say, countryside to hub? That could only be done through a development plan review. Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. I'll turn now to Mr. Deeves.
Yeah. Thank you, Ma'am. This is a fresh point, but it comes back a little bit to what has just been said about the monitoring framework from the council. Also, what Mr. Roberts said, and earlier what Mr. Green said about building the right houses in the right places. The council has other policies, amongst them, as you might expect from the organisation I represent, those to do with carbon reduction. It seems to me abstruse to confine the the monitoring of the delivery of a plan to the simple, narrow definitions that the council has just stated. For instance, there are many other monitoring processes that go on within any local authority and the Shropshire Council in terms of social provision and so on, that could be brought to bear to see if the plan is doing the job for the community it is meant to serve. For instance, specifically, the Shropshire Council already has a quantitative carbon reduction monitoring programme. It is dealing with its own estate quite properly. It is looking to extend that approach into services that it contracts for, the so-called Scope 3 emissions, and I can see no reason why it should not also monitor its developments within this plan as they take place to see what the effect is on their policy of carbon reduction. So in summary, I'm urging a wide interpretation of monitoring, not just monitoring the plan for its own sake. Thank you, Mum.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that point? And that was the last speaker, so if there's any final comments you want to make on monitoring.
Thank you. With regards to that specific point, I think I point to the monitoring framework proposed in the context of policy DP11. Obviously, there's a number of proposed indicators there that look quite widely at the issues of carbon emissions and climate change more generally, if you like. I think that gives a useful look at information. I think more widely the point Mr. Dees makes, we acknowledge that we draw on a large range of information sources to inform the plan making process. I think the purpose of the monitoring framework, though, is to put in place a framework to monitor the plan. And I think that's got to be the purpose of that framework. We're not saying that we don't consider wider factors, but the purpose of this particular monitoring framework is to monitor the plan itself.
Thank you. Are there any other? Sorry.
So I was just going to say, I don't think we've got any final comments. I'm just looking down the line, around the hall. No. Any final comments? No. No. I think we're set here.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your contributions today, and we'll see you again at 9:30 tomorrow for the final bit. So coming back to matter 3 to finish off those questions, and then matter 5, which will follow on from that. I don't think we've got anybody participating in matter 5, so we're just a kind of rolling programme. So hopefully we can conclude everything in the morning. Okay, thank you. Speak to you tomorrow.
Thank you.